Well, we'll start just a second with that slide. And let's
Hmm.
see.
Hmm.
All right, today's lecture on the relational approach to psychotherapy is a lecture about Dora. Uh, and let's see, I'm going to stop this. And I'd like to review just briefly where we've been in the four previous lectures. We started off thinking about the scientific backdrop of the relational listening approach, and that is the difference between the so-called modern approach of Newtonian physics, in which the belief is basically that there are truths in the universe, and it is our job to discover what they are and to define those realities, and the post-Einsteinian postmodern view, which is that the universe is so infinitely complex, we will never know all of its truths. And so what we have to do is to form various perspectives in order to study things that are of importance to us. And so in psychology, what that means is, as we study the human mind, we begin to realize that the most important thing in the known universe is the human mind, and that it is so complex that we will never understand it in terms of its truths. So the early work of psychologists and psychoanalysts trying to define such things as the unconscious or the ego or the id or whatever, trying to define things that characterize the mind, we now understand that that is a modern approach, not a postmodern approach. And so the question for postmodern thinking is, what what of all of the possibilities of the human mind are the most important things we would like to study for the purposes of psychotherapy? And at that point, we go to the work of the infant researchers and the brain researchers over the last couple of decades, and they have all made clear that the most important feature of human life and development are relationships. It was interesting, a few years ago, the American Psychological Association set up a task force to study all of the studies of psychology and psychotherapy since the beginning of psychotherapy time, hundreds of them, and they isolated many different variables that make therapy work, that make therapy important. But the one variable, and only one that came through again and again and again, is the relationship. The relationship between the therapist and the client make all the difference in terms of what happens. Some of the things that were interesting in this research is people were interviewed years after their therapy, and they were asked to say what they remembered about their therapy. And most people would say, well, I don't know exactly what we were talking about or what we were doing, but I do remember one day when she leaned forward in her chair and she said, "You what?" And she was with me at that moment. And that is the thing that made a difference in my entire life. So that what we are always working for then as psychotherapists is to have what we now call these present moments when we are eyeball to eyeball, soul to soul with our psychotherapy clients. And the infant researcher, Daniel Stern, has of course given us the wonderful book, An Idea of the Present Moment, in that the change process, whatever it is that makes for change in the human mind, in the human development, occurs in a given moment in time, meaning a moment of 7 to 16 seconds. That those are the moments that we live, just like when we have vision, we see in discrete fixations, and our central nervous system puts all that together as a panorama. So too, these 15-second moments are put together seamlessly in our mind to give us a sense of continuity in time. But in fact, we occur moment by moment by moment. And so in the psychotherapy process, we watch two people go back and forth, creating moments together. And then at some point, there's some tension, and the two of them are struggling with something until they match, they meet. And at that time, two different people are somehow changed, or two people know something different than what they knew 3 minutes ago. And so we realize that whatever it is that happens in psychotherapy, we're looking for relationships, and we're looking for relationships that exist in emotional time. Let's see. The other thing about this is we're now aware through studies of the brain that the neurons in our brain and the synapses in our brain that we're born with, the neurons during the first year of life actually move around in the head, migrate in the head in order to make connections. But what causes them to make connections are emotional relationships. So when there's a mother and a baby together around breastfeeding or singing or something, neurons begin to come together and attach themselves. And the Hebb principle, that is that neurons that fire together, mother and baby singing together, they fire together, then wire together. They stay together. And so we now know from neuroscience that at the end of the first year of life, there is a scaffolding in each baby's head. And it's different because every baby's relational experiences are different. But that scaffolding forms then the basis for personality development in the future. And a more shocking thing is that during 12 to 15 months, billions of neurons are actually pruned out by the brain. They're killed off, they're sent away, so that the scaffolding that is now the basis of relatedness will now begin to collect and change that baby in tune over the next few years. And so as we look for relationships, we're going to be looking for the first 4 or 5 years until the baby has a coherent mind that can tell stories that use symbolism like the rest of the human race. And so what we're interested in as psychotherapists is what are the relational patterns or templates that each baby experiences in the earliest months and years of life. And so the relational approach to psychotherapy seeks to understand and define those templates as they exist in each person's mind, so that as we're listening to any one of our clients, our patients, we're listening for the way they experience relationships, because they experience them in ways that nobody else on earth experiences them. But we have, over a century of psychoanalytic studies, begun to realize that there is a certain sequence of complexity of relationship possibilities that develops. Now, it's not a lockstep developmental sequence like we've had before, but it's rather a sequence of relational possibilities, from the simplest relational possibility of an infant in utero or in mother's arms, to a toddler running around the room, to a child trying to be reaffirmed as a self, to an older child, 4, 5, or 6, who is relating effectively in triangles, that is, contingent relationships, mother, father, and me, my mother, my sister, and me, my sister and me, and my brother, all possible triangles, including the family dog, including teachers, friends. All possible triangles become important for a child to study at ages 4, 5, and 6. And this is the age when symbols fully develop. So we're then especially interested in those early periods. And so what we want to do then is to form relational listening perspectives for those early periods that help us understand or listen for the kinds of things that our patients are experiencing. Now, I know in these early lectures, I've had to be fairly theoretical, and I'm sorry about that, but it seems like I have to give you the basis for the theory before we can go into listening to cases, which we will do very shortly. And as we listen to cases, I will be listening for and showing you how to listen for the relational templates from the first and the second and the third year of life, and how those appear in today's world of this particular person. Now, there's several corollaries to that. The first one is all of us have been through a relational development sequence. That is, we all lived in a womb once. We all lived in mother and father's arms once. We all began to walk around the room and find our way in the world. Then we all began to dance in the middle of the room and say, see me, see me, see me. And then we all began to get into more complex relationships with other people in the family and in the school and in the community. And so we've all been through all these sequences, and therefore we've all formed relational templates at each one of these levels. I will define for you 4 levels. We could define 40. The number doesn't matter, but over a century, 4 have seemed to emerge from psychoanalytic research. And 4 is an easy number to remember, not at first, but as you work with it a while, that 4 is a fairly easy number to remember, and so an easy number for us to work with. So again, we're not looking at a developmental lockstep movement. We're rather saying, as we all live in relationships, different templates during the course of each day come into play. And so as the therapists who are going to be good enough to share their cases with us, we're going to be listening to the way the relationship is developing and beginning to notice the templates that the patient is exhibiting as we go forward. So, but today I'm going to have a particular focus on a case study at last for you. Let me go to my slides for a moment here. All right. Okay, here's the title slide and countertransference case study, and the name of my patient. I shall call her Dora. And I'm going to show you how I failed in this case because I did not understand the countertransference. And this case was done in the early 1990s or late 1980s. And at that point in time, our countertransferences were still in flux. And it's only been since then that we've become clearer on how to use the countertransference. The next slide has my contact information. If you need anything from me, feel free to email or fax, phone, and Eve, my secretary, will help you, or I will help you, and we'll locate any materials you may need. This important website I gave you before of the International Psychotherapy Institute, free psychotherapybooks.org. There's about 150 very important psychotherapy books, many of them classic books, on this website. You simply have to go to the website, register, and download these books. I have 23 of my books on here now. Martha Stark has just added a book that's really quite good. So go through here and download whatever books you're interested in. Just published as an anniversary edition. I know on the screen it says the 20th edition, but this is 20 years old. But just last week, this book, my first book, Listening Perspectives, was published in a 40th anniversary edition, and it is also available as a free download on freepsychotherapybooks.org or on Amazon. You can order it in paperback for $19. This is a complex book, but it gives the overview of 100 years. It surveys 100 years of psychoanalytic studies in relationships and organizes them in these 4 different patterns. And this book, Relational Listening, a Handbook, was written just a couple of years ago, really for Chinese candidates at Kappa. That is, as I began working case conferences at Kappa, the students were very interested in trying to grasp the relational perspective. And at first, it seems very complex at first. Once you catch on to it, it's very simple, but at first. So they wanted a simple study. And so I wrote this book and it's dedicated to the Chinese students that I had at Kappa. Here are the 4 developmental listening perspectives. We read the chart from the bottom. Let me get that. At the bottom here, the first level that we think about in the simplest forms of relationships happen plus or minus 4 months from birth. That is, relationships begin clearly before the child is born, and particularly in the last trimester, when the child has availability, some light sensitivity, and certainly a great deal of acoustic sensitivity, and is sensitive to movements. And so we're aware that life starts 4 months before birth, or 9 months actually, but 4 for sure. And I call this the organizing experience, but it's if someone is stuck here, then they're going to have some form of psychosis, possibly schizophrenia, autism, manic depressive. So all of the primitive diagnoses would fit into this area if someone does not progress beyond those. The second level has been called by Margaret Mahler the symbiotic layer. It's the layer of interpersonal bonding or attachment experiences, and we date it 4 to 24 months. Now, attachment starts at conception and occurs all during pregnancy, but the point at which we as adults become very aware of it is along about the 4th month, when mother and father look at the baby and say, "Oh my gosh, did you see what he did today? He's getting a real personality." And parents are excited about that. And then from 4 to 24 months, what begins to develop is a certain, what's called a symbiosis, in the sense that 2 people begin to operate as one. It's not a symbiosis in the biological sense, but it's a metaphor borrowed from biology, where 2 separate organisms get a way of interacting that's smooth, that they understand, and that they know. And then towards the end of this period, right in here, in between, is the separation individuation, where the child begins to push away from the mother's ideas. And American mothers, I don't know if Chinese mothers, American mothers call this period the terrible twos, because the child is always saying no. The child says, "I know what you want, mother, but I'm not going to do it your way. I'm going to do it my way." And then mothers and babies have a period here of struggling to allow separateness among them. And then the 3rd year of life is the self-other, or what COVID has called it, the narcissistic experience of the self, the development of the self, see me. And then finally, the 4th period is 4 to 7, the period that Freud and Jung first began to study, and Melanie Klein as the Oedipus period. So now, for our purposes here for these 10 lectures, we're not going to focus on these top 2. You have other resources for that. We're rather going to be looking at these lower 2 and looking at the ways that patterns formed in the organizing period and the symbiotic period, how those patterns persist in the people that we're working with and in ourselves. So I've often said to therapists when I'm lecturing, if you want to know what your symbiotic or your organizing, that is your own borderline or psychotic experiences all you have to do is to ask someone who lives with you, as they will tell you where your crazy spots are, okay? And so, but today we're going to focus on level 2, because this is where, at the time that I was treating Dora, this was a focus. I failed to work with the countertransference at this level adequately. Then added to these 4 when we consider the four from relationship fears, what is feared at each level, it turns out I've got two books on that. They're here. One is a workbook. And here are the 7 fears that we've looked at in previous lectures. I'm not going to go over them now, but you can see that there's the 4 main experiences, and then there are fears at each level. And so the fear that we're going to be looking at with Dora are going to be here, the fear of making attachments. During the 2000 centennial celebration of the International Psychoanalytic Association, I'm happy to tell you that my 1992 book called Interpreting the Countertransference, it was named as one of the key contributions in the relational track in the last decade of the first century of psychoanalysis. And the case of Dora actually is the first chapter in this book. So there were several important things about this book, and it's now available on free download or $19 Amazon. The first thing was the opening chapter I addressed as something in which I failed. And that was not common in those days for psychoanalysts to talk about their failures. But as I showed how I failed, I was also able to show, as you will see, how I understood how I failed and what an important kind of understanding that was going forward in our field. The other thing that I did towards the end of this book, I did a careful analysis of several of Freud's dreams and letters from 1896. And I established what I believed to be was Freud's borderline level of development, Freud's symbiosis. As you know, in the days of Freud's life, no one was thinking about these pre-Oedipal periods. No one was looking at them. But Freud left us some dreams and association to the dreams that allowed me to put this together to show how even the great master, he had a symbiotic picture that didn't look too good. Like none of our symbiotic pictures look too good because we're babies and we're struggling against the forces of the world. And so my analysis of Freud's borderline level or symbiosis is in this book. This book is a follow-up book, Strategic Emotional Involvement, and it contains a series of in-depth countertransference studies contributed by 8 different Southern California therapists. And I neglected to tell you, I'm going back here, in this Interpreting the Countertransference, I have my case, and then I have 4 others contributed by different therapists. And here there's 8 others. And so these are all long-term therapy reports with the honesty of the psychotherapist and how difficult the countertransference was for each one of them, and how each one of them chose to work with the countertransference. And the most important kinds of countertransference are going to be the one we're going to be talking about today with Dora. And in this slide, just to review, I showed you here are the 4 levels again, and we looked at their developmental thrust, what's going on developmentally. We looked at what's going on in the transference. Today, we're going to look at what's going on in the countertransference. And so here the 4 levels are. I'm going to cover them very quickly. We will be coming back to them in later lectures. In the organizing experience, the countertransference feelings are like to be confusion or even terror of unintegrated experiences. That is, when we're talking with someone that is unintegrated themselves and it keeps breaking off the connection, we become confused in it and upset and sometimes even frightened. And so when we become upset and frightened, we're often working with this level of transference. In the symbiotic experience, which we'll discuss today, the countertransference feelings are likely to be a direct mother-child role. That is, the patient is experiencing me like she once experienced her mother, and she's relating to me in her child way. But the most important aspect of this turns out to be the role reversal which we will look at today, meaning at this symbiotic period, when the baby and the mother are going back and forth like this, in order for the baby to do this smoothly, the baby has not only to know her instincts and needs, but she's got to map out who mother is and what mother needs. So the baby needs to be able to say, well, when I do this, mother does that. When mother does that, I do this. So the baby has to identify with the emotional personality of the mother. And to identify means take it into her own personality. So that in the baby's personality, there are now two selves. There's the self of the baby that was born, and then now there's the self as the baby experiences the mother, and that's inside the baby. And so in the role reversal, what happens is the patient does the mother role to the therapist, and the therapist in the countertransference feels the emotional experience that that child, that person had as a 2-year-old. Repeat, in the role reversal, the patient does to the therapist what was once done to the infant self of this patient. That is, the patient has identified with the maternal role and is now acting out the maternal role and putting the therapist into the infant role. And the therapist in the countertransference is objecting to it because it doesn't fit the therapist. There's something awkward about it. And we will look at this in the Dara case. Very briefly, in the narcissistic experience, Cohen has taught us that the countertransference feelings are likely to be boredom, drowsiness, or irritation. Why? Because the narcissistic person is always saying, see me, see me, see me, and we are not invited to be involved in the relationship. And so we're bored or get drowsy. And in the independence experience of triangulation, there's the emotional conflicts and emotional stimulation are extremely strong. And these are the ones that Freud first studied as countertransference. And he began to feel like those countertransference feelings were an impediment. That is, they got in the way of the therapy. And so Freud's prescription to people working with neurosis was to contain the countertransference feelings. And if they got strong, to go to a therapy consultant. And if they got really strong, to go back into therapy. But the countertransference feelings don't belong as a part of the therapy. That was Freud's original view, and it's probably as good today as it was then when people have complex relational experiences. So these are the 4 levels. Now, I'm going to do a quick thing, just so you'll see where we're going to go in the next few lectures, on this organizing experience. Within that, there's going to be 4 different kinds of the organizing experience. That is, to psychotic level experiences. The first one, countertransference. The therapist feels that this patient is not quite human. And so it's a psychiatry kind of thing. Drug this person, lock him up. She's not quite human. She doesn't belong to the human race. She's crazy. That's the first countertransference reaction. The second, which I hope none of you have, okay. The second one is primitive psychotic anxieties are frightening. That is, when we're in a room with kind of crazy people, no matter what kind of craziness it is, it's kind of scary because we don't know what's happening next. And so we tend to keep a distance from psychotic anxieties. But as we learn, we begin to realize there's no need to keep a distance from it, that's just our own fears. And so then we learn to move into the psychotic anxieties rather than away from them. The third form is having our own empathic efforts continually thwarted by primitive organizing experiences. That is, the organizing transference is one such that the person is constantly cutting off the connection. So just when we think we've got a connection, the person turns their head, they go to the bathroom, they don't come the next session, they do something to stop the good connection. And that upsets us. Most of us, by the time we've gotten to be good therapists, we are also good at relationships. And so we're looking for a mutual back and forth exchange. And when someone comes into our presence and continues to thwart that experience, it upsets us. And it throws us back to our most primitive organizing experiences, to the experiences in us when our mothers of infancy were not there when we needed them. So it throws us back into fairly primitive mental states. And again, we're going to come back over these with cases. The fourth form is going to be empathy. In advanced stages, usually several years into the therapy, the therapist may find herself backing away from the patient for no reason at all, because the patient is doing a very good job of connecting. And what we've come to understand that is that there's an unconscious understanding on the part of the therapist that the patient is doing too much connecting too fast, and that the deep fears of connection are still there with that patient. And so the unconscious understanding is causing the therapist to withdraw. Now, the answer for that is, of course, that there's no need for us to withdraw unconsciously, but rather to do it consciously and to do it with the patient. We'll come back to all of those four forms. All right, let's see, I'll stop there. That's the slides for today. Let's see, okay. Let's see, okay. All right, this then is the case of Dora. And for reasons of discretion and accuracy, I will be actually reading this one so that the details stand out. But also, since you'll find out later, I never asked this person permission to present her case publicly. I have her very carefully disguised, but I need to be careful with what I say. The woman I speak of, Dora, saw me 2 or 3 times a week for the better part of 2 years in the late 1970s. After nearly 20, that's a disguise, it was the late 1980s. After nearly 20 years of positive professional experience, my work with her came to and remains what I consider to be the only clear-cut treatment failure I've ever suffered. Now, we all go through frustrations where the therapies end badly, but this was a clear-cut treatment failure that I later came to realize what I did wrong. All right, I will limit my remarks to countertransference that now seem to me my countertransfers to disrupt and ended our work together, leaving me with very painful and defeated sense of failure. I always saw Dora as a very gifted woman whose intelligence, creativity, and physical beauty, she was a beautiful woman, had somehow not been put to good use for her own enjoyment. She was extremely bright, she was very creative, she was very beautiful, but she hadn't been able to use those features to enrich herself and for personal growth. To her, everyday existence in most of its particulars had come to be remarkably drab, commonplace, and deeply discouraging. She had a couple of children, and she felt that she was only a housewife with nothing to offer anyone. That was her self-concept. In our relationship, Dora vacillated between elation that I could see and appreciate the wonderful person that she hoped she was, to an almost delusional suspicion that I viewed her as sick, depressed, ugly, and basically the disgusting person that she believed she really was. As bright and articulate people, we both were able to discuss these concerns between us in great detail and relate them to current life circumstances with her husband, with her children, with friends, as well as related them to many growing up experiences. I used the developmental metaphor of borderline to describe for myself her chronic and to her depressing ways of relating to people around her. The particular thread of our relationship that I wish to follow here was that we both came to see her as sexualized attraction toward me. Held in silence for more than a year, Dora finally confessed with trepidation one day that she had always had a weakness for blue eyes, especially in the exact combination with the brown hair that I have. Several of her significant men friends have been of similar coloring and build. I handled her anxious confession with a series of inquiries meant to elicit associations about why it had taken her so long to share this with me. What problems was this attraction posing for her? If I was her type, as she said, why couldn't we simply just enjoy that together? I wasn't sure what made her so uneasy over the issue. Was there anything I was doing that made things difficult? Was there anything I could do to make things easier? Our discussion brought her relief, and in subsequent months, a series of expressions emerged. She was concerned that she wasn't supposed to be attracted to me, but she couldn't help it. Yes, at times her attraction had made it difficult to speak with me about certain issues, but if there ever were anything really important, she believed that she had been able to overcome it, and she believed me to be a very accepting person. So at the end of good hours, she would often sit up for a few moments before leaving the couch and let me know what a pleasure it was. I saw her 3 days a week she used the Freudian couch. She let me know, she would look at me deeply and let me know what a pleasure it was simply to look at me and to feel that I was okay with her looking at me. She would sink into the couch in deep, pleasurable relaxation, feeling deeply reassured by being able to sit and look at me. One day, while telling me about a friend of hers who had just been diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, which many AIDS people were dying of, and explaining to me about his AIDS, this was the new disease among gays. She confessed her concern that I might be gay. She was afraid I would be offended by her saying so she had carefully avoided any mention of the topic. Over the years, she had been close to a number of gay men and had wondered about the implications of that closeness for herself and her sexuality. She wondered, was she attracted to gay men because she was afraid of straight men? She had recognized several attractions to women friends in the past, but had never wished to develop the sexual side of these relationships. Perhaps she was projecting her latent homosexuality onto me, she thought. I asked if the idea that I might be gay was reassuring to her. She immediately saw the potential protective side of her fantasy, saying, then I wouldn't have to be concerned about my attraction towards you. But she hoped that I wasn't gay because her recently diagnosed friend had been miserable for years, searching bathhouses and bars every night with one disastrous relationship after another. She hoped that whatever my personal circumstances were, that I wasn't miserable and that I was safe from agony, disease, and AIDS death. She spoke of potential abandonment and her fear of being left alone. She concluded by reassuring either herself or me, or both of us, that there was really no need to worry since she was sure I wasn't gay. I must be a good fuck, she said, the kind she had always imagined having for herself. Now, many will feel critical of my technique upon learning how, throughout this time, I handled numerous and frequent demands for reassurance. Did I think highly of her? I did, and I told her so. Could I see her artistic creativity in the productions she brought to me? I could. Did I find her an attractive person? Yes, I did, and so on. I had attempted early on the usual set of inquiries about what brought these concerns up at this particular point in time. Was her question possibly related to other things she had been talking or thinking about? My inquiries not only failed to elicit associations, but regularly increased her agitation. When I followed it up, the result was either deep feelings of worthlessness, because I probably really didn't like her, or feelings of rage towards me for playing a cat and mouse Freudian game with her. After all, she believed she had a reasonable right to know what I thought of her. Even if she granted me the privacy of specifics, couldn't I at least acknowledge feelings and thoughts we both knew about anyway? In response to my suggestions that answers would reassure her, and that then her anxiety, depression, and anger that she felt might be overlooked by both of us, she responded, bullshit, 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 and more bullshit. You Freudians are all alike. There's no reason why we can't be honest here. After all, you're supposed to be completely analyzed, aren't you? In some profound sense, she seemed to be right. And when I felt freer in my expressions towards her, our work went much more smoothly. But for some reason, I was not happy having to serve as a reassuring function for her so frequently. Did you feel a kind of transference coming up? I didn't like to have to reassure her so often. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't like it. On several occasions, she stared at my arms and her chest with delighted squeals. She declared that she had always been a chest woman, and that my general build, and specifically the chest and the little black hairs that occasionally peeped out of my open shirt, just drove her crazy. Now, in reviewing my feelings about the matter, it's clear that in many ways I enjoyed her sexual attraction to me. However, I came to be aware of feeling self-conscious, and in the morning, I occasionally found myself sorting through which shirts or pants to wear on a day I would be seeing her. And I became aware of this kind of transference there, but I wasn't sure what it meant. All my attempts to make any analytic headway on these developments in our relationship resulted in a bland response from her. However, she gradually replaced most of her wardrobe and began paying attention to small details in her makeup and hair. Her current sexual relationship with her husband improved considerably. She discussed this jubilantly as her progress in getting rid of her drab, weepy, homely self. She was enjoying make the best of what she had. She attributed the changes to the new freedom she was feeling as a result of her therapy, something I believe in many ways was quite true. She was further able to say that seeing herself through my eyes made her alive to the fine person that she was, and to the ways she might come to enjoy herself, others, and the world in general. There was similar evidence of increased self-esteem in a variety of social and occupational shifts. Her improvement, in fact, was dramatic. In retrospect, perhaps a sign to me of a developing problem. Now, what I mean by that is she was changing so much and so fast. Was that true change, or was that more of a false self-conformity, wanting to look better for herself and for me? Looking back, I see that was perhaps never made fully explicit. Was how much these improvements in self-esteem and related activities remain dependent upon my real or fantasy estimate of her. At this point in writing up my work, when I was writing this case up, I found myself developing a severe headache, a frequent complaint of hers. And I'm not given to headache, but when I'm writing this and struggling with what this is about, I got a headache, and I feel like it was her headache. In general, however, we both felt good about the analysis, and others close to her, her friends and family, experienced a considerable easing of tension. A temper tantrum or terrible twos quality that she called bitchiness would occasionally appear, and we could relate it to her relationship with her mother. Later, in grasping at straws to understand what was going on, I was able to formulate for consultation with colleagues a detailed set of interactions or scenarios I'd been considering. I still believe, what I do is the same thing that I hope you do. When I'm working on a case, and particularly when I feel there's pieces that I'm not understanding very well, I always go for a consultation with colleagues. I mean, I've been practicing for 50 years, but that doesn't make countertransference go away. No matter how long we practice, our emotional life still gets in the way. So I have a number of case consultation groups with peers. And so I presented my work to her with some of my peers, and I tried to talk about some of the scenarios that we're developing in between her and me. And I feel like we did some good work in relating what she was doing with me to early relationship with her mother. Her mother was central. But no amount of work on the symbiotic and separating replications was able to avert the impasse that developed. We both saw and could talk about her behaving towards me as she had behaved towards her mother. We could even discuss her behaving as her mother had behaved towards her, interactions towards me. The usual regressions and resurgences of symptoms occurred prior to weekend and holiday breaks. I might add that Cohut-style interpretations of empathic failure were seldom useful. On the other hand, she took readily to developmental metaphors. Once she saw a copy of Kaplan's book, Oneness and Separateness, on my desk, and she asked to borrow it. She derived much mileage from the book in terms of understanding her own ambivalent relationship with her mother, that is, the splitting, the good mother, bad mother, and the pronounced but erratic mood swings to which she was prone. Another time, just before a holiday, she brought a lovely black, shiny pebble that she had found on the beach and had taken to have polished for me. It sits to this day in an antique inkwell, my grandfather's, in my office. I occasionally pick it up and think fondly of her. The seeds of the trauma that eventually resulted in her breaking off our relationship were sown one day about midway through the 2-year period of analysis. She had begun enjoying her newfound capacity to tell me about her attraction towards me and to just sit quietly for periods, taking pleasure in listening to me or looking at me. She learned to just enjoy that. I felt squirmy when she did this. I didn't like it. But at some level, I also enjoyed being looked at and being enjoyed in the deep, satisfying way she took me in. I was pleased that she derived a great deal of pleasure from our interaction because there's so few pleasures in her life for her at that time. One day, however, in what way, I don't know, she caught my discomfort. She just saw it on me. I was trying hard to be there for her in the way that I was sure she wanted me to be, which was warm and empathic, and I was cautious about letting my uneasiness show. But my guard must have been down, and she caught me flinching, that was her word, flinching, or averting my gaze in some way or other. Nothing was said at the time. I had been painfully aware for a while of my growing dislike of her parading her erotic attachment in front of me and my wish to escape her gaze, her intensity, and the sense of intrusion that stimulation by this very attractive woman was provoking in me. The following session, she came in bedraggled, wearing old clothes, no makeup. She lay down on the couch wordlessly. I waited a long while until quiet sobs began. She had frequently cried bitterly, but this seemed somehow different, much deeper and much worse than any crying she had done before. Not until she began talking was I aware that she had detected my discomfort in the previous hour. She had concluded that our whole relationship had been a giant fraud, just as she has vaguely suspected all the way along. I didn't really like her. It was a therapeutic trick. Make the patient feel better so they keep coming. She had been wasting her time. She had hoped after all the years of never being recognized or responded to, that at last she had found someone who could like her and be her friend. There was more withdrawal, more hurt, more tears, and then anger. I sensed no qualities of manipulation or even hope. Rather, there was a total collapse of all that had been experienced as good and a very deep sense of despair and rage had overtaken her. I often wished I could recall my exact responses during that hour. But it passed too quickly, and I was struggling so hard to stay afloat that I'm not sure I could have recalled the details sufficiently to make notes. I was really working to just stay present. I was basically able to empathize with how perfectly terrible she must feel, and I was even able to add specifics from my understanding of her that portrayed her devastation even more vividly and related it to past devastations and loss in her life. But while she acknowledged and appreciated my empathy, it could not, as she said, put Humpty Dumpty together again. It seemed clear to me that I must try somehow to acknowledge the truth of what she saw. So often in the past, her correct perceptions had been invalidated by adult opinion. Do you know Humpty Dumpty? Is, is, that, is Humpty Dumpty known in China? Humpty Dumpty is from a child's nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty is an egg, is a big egg, sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty together again. So children learn that. Humpty Dumpty, big egg, sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty together again. And so she's saying, I'm shattered. There's no way to put me together again. Somewhat reluctantly, I confirmed that in fact I had become uncomfortable with her admiration of me and my body, and I was not completely sure exactly what I was feeling yet. However, I told her that as nearly as I could tell, she was wrong in her interpretation, that I hated her, that I was perpetuating an analytic hoax, and that it was all an act, presumably for her own good. Hoping to save the scene and to ease her out of her dreadfully painful state, I told her that she should not hold herself responsible for my reactions to her admiration. I disclosed that my emerging feelings of discomfort came more from myself than from her. Now, and that's the end of the hour. She left. In fact, while I did not mention it to her, I had been occupied for some time attempting, as a result of my countertransference uneasiness, to dredge out some experiences from my own pre-adolescent childhood, when for a protracted period of time, I had felt subjected to similar erotic intrusive staring and the parading of erotic attachment that had produced similar feelings of overstimulation and uneasiness in me. Now, in my 1992 book, I did not feel free to disclose what that was, but I'll tell you. When I was 8 years old, I had a younger brother, 5 years old, but my parents had always wanted a girl. And so one day, my father, without any notice, brought home two girls for adoption. These two girls had a schizophrenic mother, and they were both very disturbed. They were aged 5 and 3. I was 8. And the 5-year-old, the day she entered my house, declared that she was in love with me and she was going to grow up and marry me. And so from age 8 to 18 in my childhood home, she's beautiful today, this beautiful young lady, adolescent, paraded around the house in nothing but her bra and her underwear. And I asked my parents for help. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to see. And I hated all of this erotic intrusion. So there was a deep-seated hatred of being looked at in that way. And as I went to my analysis for it, that also replicated some feelings of early on from my mother being overly involved with me. Well, during that session, when Dora registered some astonishment and disbelief at my taking responsibility for my flinching, as we came later to refer the incident, I partially revealed some of my previous experience. I didn't tell her the details and apologized for its intrusion into her processes in this very painful manner. The disclosure and the apology were authentic and did serve to pull her out of her disastrous state. Summarizing the after effects of the incident. By the way, I did take that incident, of course, to my group of colleagues who helped me a great deal, just dealing with the painful feelings that were coming up from my childhood. Summarizing the after effects of the incident, I will say that our work resumed at its regular pace after a few halting sessions. She did, however, carefully refrain from, as she said, overwhelming me again by staring or making a point of enjoying me. My inquiries into why she felt she had to alter her spontaneity to protect me were met with responses somewhere between, on the one hand, an understanding and a respect for an area that was sensitive to me personally, and on the other hand, a mild sarcasm that she must not express to me her true self and risk offending or upsetting me or my abandoning her. When I challenged this, she acknowledged that she didn't really think I was so fragile, but she liked me a lot. And part of what she had been working on everywhere as a result of her therapy was becoming a better person to people, a trend that she was having some very good integrating experiences with. I remained unconvinced of this explanation of the alteration of our relationships. And from time to time, I told her so. I said, I appreciate your consideration of me, but I feel like there's some pieces of yourself that you're leaving out here. The flinching incident came up in a variety of ways over the next year and was put to good use on a number of occasions by both of us. The final blow took me by surprise. For a full year, she had been preparing for an advanced examination relating to her career, taking classes, studying, and working through trial exams and review seminars. Her preparations were loaded with anxiety, but also full of forward-looking hope and creative prospects. I told you she's brilliant, so she was preparing for a very good profession. The exam came, and she felt pleased that she had maintained well, budgeted her time efficiently, and completed the test with a reasonable sense of security. This is the days before we had instant computer scoring, so it took 3 weeks for the score to come back. The day of triumph came several weeks later with an on top of the world sense of glee, a tenth of champagne, small one, 2 champagne glasses for us to celebrate her having attained the highest possible percentile score. Well, it was 11 o'clock in the morning, so I managed to beg off the champagne with a few celebration sips. She was in her glory. We celebrated all of her successes over the last 2 years and the immense prospects for her future career that the new placement that the exam had made possible for her. There was a jubilant celebration feeling between us. As in most champagne reviews, we were discussing the before and after picture, jointly taking credit for the big step forward into a new, never before dreamed of sense of success and independence. During our review, she asked me to tell her how I viewed her work together. Trying as much as possible, as is my custom, to stay with the metaphors provided by the person in analysis, I said, quote, when we began, you were so invested in thinking yourself as weepy, drab, and homely. Now we've proved all of that wrong.
Sorry, Larry.
Yes.
Please.
Larry, would you please
Yeah.
just sit up a little bit, because now we can only see the head, your head, but
Oh,
not your
okay.
shoulder. Yeah, your camera.
That way? No.
Yes.
Other way.
No.
The other way.
The other way. The other way.
All right.
Yes,
Sorry
yes.
about that.
Now it's better. No. That's great. Okay,
All right.
thank you.
All right. Okay.
Much better.
All right. Sorry about that. So I told her that at first you saw yourself that way. Now we know that's not true. At first, she seemed pleased with my assessment, but after a few moments, her whole affect suddenly changed to enraged grief, and our celebration came to a screeching halt. The truth had finally come out. All along, I had seen her as a weepy, drab, homely person, and now she had heard it with her own ears. She knew it was true. I'd even tried to lie my way out of it, saying the flinch was personal and unrelated to my feelings about her. She would never be able to trust me again. She screamed at me with huge tears running down her face, and at last stormed out of the room. To say I was speechless wouldn't be entirely correct, but nothing I could say seemed to help. She was adamant that she had not misunderstood me. I simply had finally confirmed what she had known all along. She called and left a message canceling all future appointments. After a few weeks, she continued to come in for a few sessions. I gave her some referrals. She found a therapist on her own, and I never saw or heard from her again. Now, what I had missed was the emotional impact of the countertransference that in a certain sense had nothing to do with the issue of sex. That is, she was doing to me what her mother had done to her, which was to intrude and make her feel uncomfortable. She had found the place in my personality where she could intrude and replicate that sense of deep discomfort. But I didn't understand that. I understood the intrusion as sexual rather than as an emotional intrusion that was making me uncomfortable. And so I missed completely the importance of the countertransference. Now, you can go to this book and read the entire case study and see how it unfolded and the way I began to go back and review all of the different times that her mother had done humiliating things to her and left her feeling uncomfortable, helpless, hopeless, and that she had managed to do that to me. So to conclude this, I'd like to say that when we think about erotic transference and countertransference, there's usually three ways that we think about it, about the erotic transference. The first way is that we now understand that the beginning of what later is known after puberty as sexuality and as eros begins in the earliest mother-child relationship in terms of the sensuality that a mother and a baby feel together. So the roots of our adult sexuality go back to mother and child sensuality. And for people who have not been able to move past the faulty attachment level, they often confuse the early sensuality with sexuality. So when the therapeutic relationship goes to where there's a good feeling between two people, often patients will sexualize that. And they will either sexualize it by projecting their own erotic feelings onto the therapist or projecting their erotic feelings onto them, to owning them themselves. But in any event, it's a fusion and confusion of early sensuality with later sexuality. The second reason that sexual countertransference often is important is that during the borderline level, the symbiotic level, there are poor boundaries. Mother and child are intertwining. And it's really only during the separation individuation of the second and third year of life that mother and baby begin to develop better boundaries. So when we have a patient that's working on the borderline or character level in their work with us, they may well confuse the boundaries. And in the boundaries, they may well confuse their own sexual feelings and project them onto the therapist, or confuse the therapist's warmth or understanding with their own sensuality or sexuality. The third form of countertransference we've seen in this case, erotic transference, sorry. The third form of erotic transference is where the erotic part is the function of the therapist's personality. That is, I saw her for 2 years, 3 times a week. There was nothing in her case history to suggest that she'd ever been sexually molested or that there was ever any sexual difficulty in her childhood. She'd had an average experience, but she had an extremely intrusive, provocative mother who was always in her face about this and this and this, not allowing her freedom of her own thought. And so as she went to the role reversal transference, she was doing to me what was done to her by her mother, but she found the dimension in which she could make it work with me, which, because of my sexualized history, turned out that I was afraid of erotic intrusions and that I didn't like them. She somehow found that spot, and then she pushed on me and pushed on me and pushed on me like her mother pushed on her around other things. So the point of the replicated scenario was the intrusiveness and the discomfort and how damaged she had been by all of her mother's lacking boundaries, her mother's intrusions, her mother's lack of good sensuality. And so all of the faulty mothering that she had during the borderline period and the lack of being able to separate and to individuate that her mother had, that then came up in our therapy, and I failed to see it. I failed to understand it. Since then, as you can read in this book, I've come to understand it very clearly. We will see instances of it in some of the later case studies where the sensitivities of the therapist are regularly picked up by the client unconsciously. There's an unconscious to unconscious communication. And so the replication of this pre-verbal level is done through the emotional interaction between the therapist and the patient. I think we have questions. Start us off, Sammy.
No problem. 那我们现在可以开始 Q&A 的这个部分了。
I have a question.
All right. Sarah.
Sarah. When you talk about the sexuality and the erotic transference,
Yes.
A story coming to my mind. A boy live up with a so-called dead mother. The mother was there and gave him eating and warmth, but the mother couldn't understand him. He felt this mother was dead, and his way of get the merge or a live mother is sexualized.
Yes.
He looked for such a mother here and there, and I wonder about your thinking about these kinds of situation. What do you think? Yeah.
All right. Well, how did he relate to you?
I didn't get the permission, so I cannot say more about this.
Well, let me say then I will surmise that that in some way or another he brought the sexual experience from his mother into the therapy, he had a sexual experience of you, or he projected and believed that you had a sexual experience of him, or both. But as a result of it, that he undoubtedly found some way to tap into the countertransference so that he could get you to feel what the damage was to his mother. And your case may be very much like mine in the sense that the issue with his mother may not have been so much sexual as simply intrusive and abusive, but it might have been sexual. So in either way, he brought the transference to you. And I can well imagine how difficult it was to work with that kind of transference. You know, we don't know what to do with it. And I'm hoping that my story of Dora begins to say what I could have done with Dora. And since our relationship was so good, I could have done to her, I could have begun to say to her that she had found a spot in me that I was sensitive to, and that she was pushing and making me feel uncomfortable, just in the same way that her mother had pushed and pushed and pushed. And we had many examples of terrible things that her mother had done to her, not overtly abusive, but just unmotherly and without bounds. And I could have gone back and said, and now you're doing those things to me, and it's not so bad that you're doing them. You're trying to show me what your experience was like. That's key. You're trying to show me how you felt when your mother intruded on you. And I can tell you, I don't like that feeling. I don't like it when you intrude on me. See? And now, but keep that different from me, Larry, not liking this. Let's look at this as you're showing me how it was for you with your mother. And I can tell, and as a child, a 2 and 3 year old child, and then a child growing up, you couldn't say to your mother what I said, which is, this bothers me. I don't like it, Mom. Back off. A child can't say that. But I could, but you see, I failed to. She would have been okay. She's very bright and very cooperative, and she liked her therapy, and she liked me. If if I had been able to say, what you're doing to me, I don't like, it makes me very uncomfortable. But the reason it makes me uncomfortable is because it's something in me. But you have found that spot, and therefore you have succeeded in showing me what it felt like to be a little girl with your mother constantly intruding. She would have gotten that, you know, but I didn't know to say it. In my Interpreting the Countertransference book, I have a series of vignettes that show how this can be done, how as therapists we can get into showing the client how the countertransference is their successful communication to us about their childhood experience that happened before they could speak. That's the key thing. It's the role reversal countertransference fits at the symbiotic level, and that's pre-verbal. So the patient cannot tell us what that felt like because there were no words. There was just interaction, emotional interaction, body memories. And so in the interaction with us, the material is going to be communicated through emotional interactions and body reactions. Remember, I was having that headache when I was writing it up. Okay, there were her headaches. Okay, she is a child that had headaches because she wanted to tell her mother to fuck off, but as a child she couldn't. Well, I wanted to tell her to leave me alone too, but I was afraid to, for my own reasons. And so she showed me how terrible it was to feel inhibited. Okay, next question. Got another question?
If there's okay, Lily.
Go ahead.
Lily? Does Lily have a question? No.
Oh, okay. I have a question. It's related to the preverb stage. I have wondered. It's about if you ever experience this kind of situation when you use your countertransference and try to give that kind of interpretation to a patient.
Yes.
But somehow, for some reasons, this patient just cannot get in touch with what you are talking about.
Right.
It's like the interpretation you said you've done to Dara, but if there is possibility for Dara cannot understand what you're talking about because there is no verbal there.
Okay. Now, if there was only the verbal, you're absolutely right. But you see, what we had was 2 years of emotional connection. And she had connected to me and I to her. So at some point, the question was, so the material was alive. It was in the room, it was in the relationship. So the question now is, how do we take it from the unconscious and move it into consciousness? And we do it with words. That's how we always do that. But you see, she's no longer a child. She's no longer a pre-verbal child. She's a well-developed adult who has words. So now that she has communicated the pre-verbal feelings and she's lived them with me, then it's possible for me to begin to, for the two of us together, to begin putting them into words. And let me tell you how I sometimes do this, because now I frequently do it. Suppose I begin to have some sense that in the countertransference, I have some information that belongs to the patient that's not mine. That is, when we think we have countertransference, we're always questioning how much of this is mine. Okay, that's the first question. But then when we begin to feel like, wait a minute, there's more going on here that's not mine, and then when we begin to get some sense of it, I might say to the patient one day, I have some things I'd like to talk to you about. And the patient goes, whoa, whoa, okay, let's talk about them. And I say, you know how some days you come in and you have a story to tell me. And so you go to the story, da 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 da, and you know the story is important, but you don't know why it's important. And I don't either. And so we sit here sort of feeling stupid, knowing that this story is very important to your analysis. And so we just talk about it a little while. And as we talk about it, all of a sudden, one of us says, oh, I know why that story or that dream is so important. And it could be that the patient is the one to say, aha, or it could be the therapist. It doesn't matter. One or the other could say, ah, this is what this is about. Well, I say to my patient, I have those same sort of experiences of having half-baked thoughts and feelings. Half-baked is clear? Not completely baked, half-baked, okay? So half-baked experiences that I don't understand myself, but I think are important for us. And so I, from time to time, would like to be able to just throw my half-baked ideas or thoughts out and let us talk about them with the hope that maybe there's something important for us and for you in it that I don't understand myself. How about it? So the patient, of course, patients are always rather curious. Okay, doctor, tell me what your half-baked thought is. So then I say what my feelings are. In this case, I would have been saying to Dora, I have a sense that the uncomfortable feelings that I'm feeling with your sexual interest in me, they're really not about sex at all. They're about, I experience intrusions into sensitive place in my being. And given how your mother used to do this and this and this and this to you, she was always intruding into your sensitive places. And so I feel like you succeeded in showing me, by making me uncomfortable, showing me what it was like with your mother. I think it's been a successful communication. Now, sometimes the patient, starts to say, oh, well, no, I don't want to go there. I say, no. This is not about me being uncomfortable. I can be plenty uncomfortable. That's not it. It's that my discomfort perhaps can tell us something about what's going on between us. And that's when we begin to work on it and talk on it. So that's the way that we come to interpreting the countertransference, by letting the emotional body reactions come up and then finding ways to talk about them and move them from the pre-verbal level of infancy to the verbal level of adulthood. And when you first start to do this, it's very scary, because you know that in some way or another, whatever you're feeling does have to do with your personal countertransference. I mean, of course, whatever feelings you have are filtered through your own personality. So like with me, I knew full well the whole story about my sisters and all of that erotic stimulation. So I thought, well, this is me. This has nothing to do with her. If she likes to look at me and feel a pleasure with her sexual attraction to me, why not? But you see, in doing that and taking responsibility myself for the countertransference, I then missed the opportunity to say, there's something going on here. And I think my discomfort is teaching us something about your childhood. Can we work on this? So, and I did not know to say that. Now, in my countertransference books, we have numerous examples of that. And I call it interpreting the countertransference, which is the same as speaking the countertransference. And as you know, during the first 50 to 75 years of our field, we were taught not to ever reveal the countertransference. Now that we understand the pre-verbal levels of personality, we begin to understand that the only way to work with those pre-verbal levels is through the countertransference. How's that? Lily, get it? We have a few more minutes.
All
All right.
I have a question. Yeah.
Okay, Lily, go for it.
Yeah, actually, I have a idea about the case Dora. I think if there's a kind of projective identification,
Yes.
I noted that the Dora is really intrusive, kind of intrusive, and I noted that you are very kind in the therapy work with her, and maybe you kind of unconsciously hide some uneasy feelings.
Yes,
and
yes,
I
I'm
think
sure.
is that also a copy of what Dora did with her mother when she was very young?
Absolutely. Right on. Right on. And you mentioned projective identification. That's exactly, of course, what this is. Melanie Klein formulates it in different terms. But the projective identification, according to Klein, that she could project either self or object into me. She could project either aspects of her bad self or aspects of her bad object. But the Kleinians never moved so far as to talk about it. They tried to interpret it, but not in terms of the interpersonal dimension. Now, today, I'm sure modern Kleinians would do that because since all of the things I mentioned last week that happened in London in the 50s and then all the way up to the 70s and 80s, we now are using the countertransference much more. But when Melanie Klein was writing, she saw it projected. So what we would say is that Dora projected her mother into me, and I identified with her mother, or she projected her child self into me, and I identified with her child self while she identified with her mother. And that would be a Kleinian way of talking about this. Yes, thank you for that.
Thank you.
That reminds me of one other thing I failed to say in our introduction that I've said before. One thing I'm hoping that as you follow these lectures on a relational approach to psychotherapy, you'll begin to realize that the relational approach is not another school of psychotherapy. It's not another way of relating. That is, we've had many different schools of psychotherapy, but at this point in time, our entire field, all different schools of psychotherapy are beginning to pick up on the importance of the relationship. So whether you're working with DBT, CBT, EFT, whatever it is, you'll be aware now that all therapists everywhere are beginning to look at the relationship, and they're looking at it in different ways. So what my lectures and my supervision hope to show you is a certain way of considering the relational dimension. So no matter what form of therapy you do or prefer to do, if you can begin to think in terms of these developmental templates being present in transference and countertransference, it will help the work no matter how you're working. So this is not another school of therapy, it's rather an approach to thinking about the importance of all relationships, really in all forms of psychotherapy. Okay. We have 5 more minutes. Do you have something, Summer?
Yes. Dora asked you to tell her how you viewed your work together.
Yes.
And, you didn't realize your countertransference, but you still gave her assessment, like
Yes.
She experienced herself as a VP job at Homely, something like that, and she knew that was true. So I was thinking, what made me feel curious is you had a good relationship, actually, and that's a rupture. You didn't get it, but how come it terminates the relationship, and how you understand? Thinking how Dora experienced it and why it affected so much on her.
There's many answers to that, but it's a great question. Recall that in the beginning of the case, I talked about how I was constantly reassuring her that she felt a need for me to say how nice she was, how beautiful she was, how creative she was. And I was uncomfortable with that because I don't ordinarily volunteer that. But she wanted to know, and I was truthful. I wasn't going to lie to her, and I wasn't going to just simply pretend I wasn't going to talk to her. So she needed to be talked to, and she needed me to reassure her. Now, with hindsight, there I was again in the role of little Dora, child Dora, reassuring her mother that everything was okay, telling her mother that she was fine, doing to her mother things that made her mother happy, but forgetting how uneasy she felt by it all. Mother was intruding, needing to be reassured, and the child could reassure her, but the child didn't like it. And so she did the same thing to me. So in ever so many ways, she tried to show me what was going on. She worked hard at it. I had no way to get it. Now, another reason why this book, I believe, was selected as one of the 10 most important books of the decade of the 90s in the relational track was because of this case. Because I brought the case out and I showed how we need to be able to work with the countertransference. But at that point in time, nobody really understood this. Nobody understood the role reversal. Now, Melanie Klein had talked about self and object projective identification, but that didn't do it because it didn't allow for the symbiosis to be replicated non-verbally. So at the time that this book was published, this was a new set of ideas. And so the fact that I was willing to put them out and confess to a failure, and then also be able to say, I now understand with hindsight, 10 years later, what happened. And I had been helped in my article here, the chapter. I credit Christopher Bolus with helping me in this because he was the first British person to begin to see this. And that was based on the work of Winnicott. Winnicott understood the mother-child relationship very thoroughly and how the two of them identified with each other. But it was Bolus who took it into the realm of the countertransference. And Bolus' question is, he says, in the old days, we expected our neurotic patients to lay on the couch and free associate and tell us everything that was necessary for the analysis. Today, we see a lot of people that are pre-edible, pre-verbal, and they cannot speak what's important to their analysis. So if they can't tell us what it is, who's going to speak it? And Bolo's answer is, the analyst. That is, it is we who come to understand through the countertransference the early nonverbal material of the client, and we must find some way of bringing it into speech and into the relationship so the patient can make use of it because it belongs to the patient. This belonged to her. It didn't belong to me. And yet, because it was filtered through my personality, I failed to see and turn it back to help her with what she needed help with. All right, Sammy, we're finished. So I'll see you
今天的
all
时间到了，
okay, for lecture 6. And we're going to do more countertransference. All right.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Yes, thank
Bye.
you. Thank you
See
very
ya.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.